So I've been wanting to start these Valorant minifigures for a while now. For all the game's sins, its characters are distinct, colourful, moderately detailed, and all of them are pretty human shaped, so translating them into minifigures should be pretty seamless. Honestly, in that way it makes more sense to make Valorant minifigures than Apex Legends ones. Anyway, for Astra specifically, finding a hairpiece for her was really easy. I instantly found this mohawk piece that worked really well for her. All it needed was a little tilt adjustment to get the height of the spikes right, and I was pretty much done. I used Leia's face print from the UCS Falcon as the base, and I spent quite a while trying to get this right because the expression is really subtle. I also needed to keep the angle of the pupils in mind to make sure that she's looking directly into the camera while her head is tilted in the final pose. I experimented with giving her bright brown eyes, which I think looked better in Photoshop than it did on the actual figure. I don't think it meshed overly well with her skin tone, and it just kind of looked weird. I added the details for her face piercing stuff, and I had to decide whether to give them a black outline or not. I did decide to, because I think when I didn't, and just had the gold printed directly onto it, that it looked way better in Photoshop, probably again because the gold colour blends with her skin tone, which I think makes them hard to see. Definitely the trickiest part of the face print was getting her pupils in just the right spot. That took a good bit of adjustment and just trial and error. Because I had to angle her head to get the face print right, I figured the next step should actually be posing the figure, which is a drastic departure from my usual process, but it is probably for the better in a few ways. Usually I do the pose last and do all the prints first, but this has led to some situations where I would have spent however long on an arm print only to have it not at all visible on the final render, which was just a waste of time. In this figure, for example, I realized the right arm print would be totally invisible on the final pose, so I knew I just didn't have to bother with it. Also, this pose is surprisingly dramatic, especially with her right leg. The knee and ankles were pretty much at maximum bend for this pose, so by handling that now before I even do the print, I can adjust the print later to not look super distorted on the final render, but I'll get more into that later. I also changed the golden arm from a speckled gold, which I thought would look better in the render, to a pearlescent warm gold, and eventually a jewel molded arm with the bottom half being a hot pink colour. But again, more on that later. I also added a scarf and waist scarf to finish off her figure in that way. The colours for these were really difficult to decide on because there's 3 distinct purple shades for her legs, neck scarf and waist scarf, and none of them really match the official LEGO colour palette. The rest of the colours, especially for her leg pieces, were also really difficult to actually decide on. None of the official LEGO colours, but purple especially, really fit perfectly for her pants, and in particular her scarf was just in this weird zone where no colour quite fit right. That was a pain, but I eventually got it done at least. The torso print was really simple, especially compared to some Apex Legends characters. I feel like Valorant characters in general will have relatively simple torso prints with like large areas of flat colour. That'll be interesting to take note of going forward at least. This one did have a decent amount of detail to it, mainly because I added some of the scarf as part of this torso print. I think it adds a strong diagonal line to the character, which makes it much more interesting than if it just had like a symmetrical jacket thing set up for her. Other than that, I did try to add some texture with the circle prints on the grey areas of her waist, and some shadows just to break up the otherwise very large and flat azure blue colour on her shirt. Her waist print was a lot more detailed and interesting than I expected. The pouch on her left needed to extend into the leg print, so that was fine, and the triangle buckles on her right side also needed to. I'm not incredibly pleased with how I did the scrunched up part of her waist scarf thing, but I think it gets the point across at least. I did take some creative liberties with using different shades of grey for her belt, which I think worked out nicely. The white highlights on her pouch and stuff may have been a bit overboard though, which is something I'm guilty of doing a lot with these figures, truth be told. Her right leg though caused me a lot of trouble and ended up being easily the most detailed and difficult section of this entire figure. I don't even know where to begin with it. First things first, she's wearing high top shoes, which are very detailed. So they definitely needed side leg printing, and looking at the posed figure, it needed inside leg printing too. So this is already the most detailed leg print I'd ever done. But I couldn't really just do jewel molded legs because that would imply that she's wearing boots, and that would be too tall for these shoes. So my solution was to just print the high top details onto that area directly above the feet, where LEGO generally never prints, but I've established that I can and will do that for all these custom minifigures. That wouldn't be a problem in and of itself. The problem came with how distorted the print came with the figure's extreme pose, as I mentioned earlier. The knee pad was too high up, so I had to shift it downwards onto her shin. Then the triangular belt buckle things were too high up on the print, to a point that they weren't visible on the posed figure. So I needed to really stretch this print and shift it all the way down to almost the point where the knee pad was. Here you can see how distorted I needed to make the print just to make it fit the leg properly. The leg print was absolutely not a copy and paste job, and actually only a few elements of her other leg carried over. There was this pocket she has that I was conflicted as to whether to print it on the side or the front of the legs. I decided on the front in the end because the pouch and writing needed as much space as I could give it on the side of her leg. The side has a lot of detail and is directly facing the camera, so I couldn't leave it blank. Also, the pouch was potentially too detailed, but I think it looks nice. As I mentioned earlier, I knew I didn't have to print her right arm at all because the details would be completely covered by how she's posed, so I went straight into her left arm print, which was really difficult. Before I even started, I needed to decide whether to go for the fully golden arm version from the game, or the kind of shattered half-pink version from the concept art. I decided on the concept art version and then had the task of trying to create a 2D printed version of the arm separating. This was super difficult and involved a lot of moving the shapes around to try and get it looking right. I originally had the arm dual molded with that strong pink as the base for the bottom half. I painted in the golden parts over this with a sand yellow, which I hoped would be close enough, but it looked really bad on top of the render because of how flat and plain it looked in comparison to the pearlescent gold of the top half of the arm. So my solution was to make this entire arm the same pearlescent gold colour, keep these fragmented parts transparent to allow the gold base to seep through, and then just paint on the pink base colour around it to simulate a dual molded arm with pearlescent printing. This is a really messy way to have done it, but it's the only way I could have gotten the fragments to be the right type of gold, because I can only paint in flat colours with Photoshop, and the pearlescent finish is something I can only really get from the Blender version, because it's a render specific effect that you get from like the lighting and stuff. That was done, all I needed was to add a gun for her to hold. I added 3, picked the standard one from the bunch, and adjusted the pose as I needed for it. In terms of the Photoshop adjustments, there was a few things I needed to touch up. Firstly, there was the inner part of her right leg. This print got extremely distorted from the pose, so I needed to go in and adjust it so it lined up with the front print and just didn't look terrible. I haven't looked ahead, but I'm hoping future characters won't need such a dramatic pose. I'm honestly surprised the Apex characters haven't run into this problem yet, but whatever. I then decided to erase the scope from the gun model. It's very far from perfect or even moderately accurate to the gun in game, but at least it kinda has the same boxy shape. I also added a very small yellow print to the side of the gun. Nothing crazy, but I think that speck of colour just visually links the gun to the rest of the figure, so the fully grey, undetailed weapon doesn't stand out as much. The top of the feet, because they weren't dual molded, were the wrong colour too, so I colour swatched the brightest shade of the dark blue and blended it in using the colour mode. It kinda stands out when you point it out and notice it, but I think on first glance you wouldn't question it, and the purple would have looked a lot weirder. I also added a gold rim paint around her scarf. I blended this on using the hue mode. I also only realised now as I'm looking back on the time lapse that I didn't correct the shape of her scarf or fix that little clipping issue above her shoulder, so that's something I need to do now. I also printed on her earrings and the hair on the side of her head. They have started printing a hearing aid piece on minifigures now, and that is right on the side of the head, so there is a precedent for printing in this area now. Then I realised that nobody gives a shit. I've broken that rule loads of times. It still feels good to not break as many of these imaginary rules as possible. I did push this with the printing on the top of her head though. I kind of extended the hairpiece a little, but also printed extremely close to the edge of the curved bit. There's no precedent for this. I think it just looked really weird to leave a large gap. This is the kind of spot where I think I crossed the line in terms of adding detail in these translations. At what stage am I just drawing the character but with a minifigure shape? I think about this self-enforced limit a lot, even though ultimately I don't think anyone really cares. The last step was adding that large, swirly, pink astral projection thing from... Jesus, that's a hard word to say. The last step was adding that large, swirly, pink astral projection thing from the concept art. There's no way I could have done this with Lego pieces, I don't think, so I just took the effects from the concept art, warped it, filled in some gaps, and placed it around her. I'm really not too happy with the solution, but I'm not sure what else I could have done with it, really. I have 3 finished figures here. There's this one, which is just the figure itself. There's this one with the special effects, and there's this one with the effects pretty heavily blurred so as not to distract from the figure itself. I don't know which one's best, so let me know what you think. I'm very curious. But yeah, that's Astra, the first Valorant character. It was fun to branch out, and I look forward to doing more. Speaking of which, time to spin the wheel to decide who's next. Again, bear in mind this might not be the next character, but it will be the next Valorant one. Fade. Okay. I think I know what fade looks like. Okay. I could do that. Well, that'd be fun, actually. Okay, cool.